She signed away her marriage with a pen that shook so badly the ink smeared. Vivian Carter didn't cry. She had already used up every tear the night before, alone in a bathroom with the door locked, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, where two tiny lives were just beginning to take root. Damian Moretti, the most feared man in New York, looked at her like she was a stranger, like 7 years meant nothing, like love was just a liability he could cut loose. He believed the lie. He chose the empire. And Vivian walked out into the cold with a secret that would one day bring the entire Moretti dynasty to its knees. If this story already has you gripped, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to hurt before it heals. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Moretti Holdings smelled like mahogany polish and old money, the kind of wealth that had been scrubbed clean so many times it had lost any trace of where it actually came from. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Manhattan's skyline, gray that morning, low clouds sitting heavy over the East River like they couldn't be bothered to move. Vivian Carter sat on one side of the long table. Her husband sat on the other. Ex-husband. As of 11 minutes ago. The attorney, a thin man named Greaves, who wore the same expressionless mask every time he entered this office, slid the final copy across the polished surface and clicked his pen once to confirm the signature had been recorded. He gathered his papers with the practiced efficiency of a man who had presided over the destruction of a dozen marriages and felt nothing about any of them. He excused himself without making eye contact with either party and closed the door behind him so softly it barely made a sound. Damian didn't move. He sat with both hands flat on the table, his suit jacket perfectly pressed, his jaw set in that particular way Vivian had learned to read years ago. Not anger exactly, but something colder than anger, certainty. The absolute, immovable certainty of a man who had already decided and wasn't interested in being told he was wrong. Vivian pulled her copy of the papers toward her and folded them once, deliberately, without looking at him. "That's it then," she said. "That's it." She had rehearsed what she would say when they got to this moment. She had rehearsed it in the car on the way over, in the elevator, standing outside the conference room door with her hand on the handle. She had planned something measured, something that didn't beg and didn't break. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was smaller than she intended. "Damian, just look at me and tell me you actually believe it." He looked at her. His eyes were dark, the color of deep water at night, and for 1/2 second she thought she saw something flicker behind them, something human. Then it was gone. "The Ricci family had information that only 3 people in my organization possessed," he said. His voice was even, controlled. The voice he used when he was talking about business rather than people. "2 of those people are dead, you're the 3rd. I didn't give them anything. The wire transfer? I've explained the wire transfer. I explained it 4 times to your people and twice to you directly. That money was from my mother's estate, Damian. It cleared probate in October. The routing numbers. The routing numbers passed through an account connected to Marco Ricci's financial network. He said it like he was reading from a report, like he had memorized this so thoroughly it no longer had any weight. I had 3 separate analysts confirm it. Your analysts told you what someone wanted them to find." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for it. She pressed one hand against the edge of the table and steadied herself. "Someone set me up. Someone inside your organization, Damian. Someone who wanted you to—" "Don't!" The word came out sharp. The first crack in the composure. He stood up, slowly, straightening his jacket with one precise tug at the lapels. "Don't make yourself the victim here. Don't make me the fool who couldn't see what was in front of him. I gave you 7 years, Vivian, 7 years of access to everything. My contacts, my operations, my trust. If someone used you to get to me, that's still a compromise I can't live with." She stared at him. "You're not even considering that you might be wrong." "I can't afford to be wrong. I'm your wife." "You were my wife." He picked up his copy of the documents and tucked them inside his jacket without looking at them. "As of 11 minutes ago." He walked toward the door. Vivian watched him go the way she had watched a dozen different versions of this moment in her nightmares over the past 3 weeks. The back of his shoulders, the unhurried pace of a man who had already closed a chapter and moved on. She had told herself she wouldn't say anything else. She had told herself she would let him leave, let him believe whatever he needed to believe, and then she would disappear the way she had been planning to for 2 weeks. but her mouth opened anyway. "I'm pregnant." He stopped. His hand was already on the door handle. He didn't turn around. The room was absolutely silent for a long moment. Just the muffled sound of the city 42 floors below, the faint hum of the building's climate system, and the sound of her own heartbeat, which she was convinced he could somehow hear from across the room. "Damien." He turned around slowly. His face had changed. The controlled blankness had fractured, not into warmth, not into relief, but into something more complicated and more painful than either of those. He looked at her stomach, then at her face, and she watched him work through it in real time. The calculation, the doubt, the suspicion that had become his first language for everything that involved her. "How far?" 8 weeks. Another silence, longer this time. "And you're just telling me now?" "I found out 2 weeks ago. I was waiting for the right—" "You were waiting," he repeated. The edge was back in his voice, not quite an accusation, not yet. "You found out 2 weeks ago that you were carrying my child, and you waited until the ink was drying on the divorce papers to tell me. Because I knew this would happen." She stood up. She was steadier now. The secret was out, and something about that released a pressure in her chest she had been carrying so long she had forgotten what breathing felt like without it. "I knew you'd use it. I knew you'd find a way to make it into another piece of evidence against me. Or you'd take control of it the way you take control of everything. And I would spend the rest of my life inside your world with no way out and no one believing a word I said. My child too." She held his gaze. "My body. My choice about where this baby comes into the world. And right now, your world is the last place I would ever bring a child." He took 2 steps toward her. She didn't step back. He stopped when they were close enough that she could see the muscle working in his jaw, could smell the faint cedar of his aftershave, could see every small thing about his face that she had memorized over 7 years and still didn't fully understand. "You don't get to make that decision alone," he said very quietly. "You made your decision 45 minutes ago when you sat down on that side of the table." She picked up her purse from the chair beside her. Her hands were steady now. She was surprised to find that they were steady. "I'll make mine." She walked past him, and she didn't look back, and she didn't let herself feel anything until she was in the elevator with the doors closed, heading down toward the lobby and the street and everything that came after. Then she pressed both hands flat against her abdomen, and she breathed, one long, shaking exhale. And she made herself a promise in the silence of that steel box dropping through 42 floors. No one would touch them. Not the Riches. Not the Morettis. Not anyone. Whatever it cost her. She had planned for this. That was the thing people would never understand about Vivian Carter. She was not a woman who was caught off guard, even when her life was coming apart at the seams. She had opened a secondary account 14 months earlier under her mother's maiden name, Reyes, at a small regional bank in Connecticut that had no connection to any of Damien's financial tentacles. She had been depositing small amounts, never enough to trigger flags, never enough to look like planning, since before she had any reason to believe she would need it. When the accusations started, when she saw the first look on Damien's face that told her he was already half gone before he said a single word to her, she had started moving faster. A storage unit in White Plains, a used car registered to a Shell LLC that would take months to trace back to anyone, a contact in Portland, a woman named Beth who had done intake work for a women's shelter and owed Vivian a favor from 4 years back. Nothing criminal, just the kind of favor that meant she knew how to disappear a person and keep her mouth shut about it. By the time Vivian signed the divorce papers, she already knew exactly where she was going. She just hadn't known, until 42 floors up with the city spread out gray below her, that she was going there for 2. Portland was a reasonable choice, far enough from New York that Damien's reach had natural limits, close enough to the coast that she could keep moving if she had to. Beth had a friend who rented a furnished apartment above a dry cleaning business in Northeast Portland. Month to month, cash, no background check, no questions. The landlord was a 60-year-old Korean woman named Mrs. Park, who had heard enough life stories to be immune to them. She handed Vivian a key on a Tuesday afternoon in late November and said only, "Heat kicks in slow. Give it an hour." Vivian gave it an hour. Then she sat on the edge of the bed in the small room with the window that looked out over a parking lot and let herself feel, for the first time in weeks, completely and entirely alone. She was 4 months along by then. The nausea had started to ease. She had seen a doctor in Connecticut under a false name, a kindly older man who hadn't asked too many questions when she paid cash and gave a P.O. box as her address, and he had told her what she had already suspected. 2 heartbeats. Strong ones. Twins. She pressed her palm against her stomach in the dim light of the Portland apartment and thought about Damien's face when she told him she was pregnant. The way he had gone very still. The calculation behind his eyes before the emotion, whatever emotion it was, could get there first. She thought about how, for just a moment, she had wanted to take the words back. Not because she regretted them, but because something in his expression had looked, for one unguarded second, like a man who had just been told he was losing something he didn't know he needed. She let herself have that thought once. Then she put it away. The months that followed were the hardest things she had ever done, and she had done hard things. She had grown up with a mother whose illness ate through money the way fire eats through paper. She had worked 2 jobs through college and entered the legal profession through a door that was perpetually half closed to women who looked like her. She had married into a world that didn't trust her, learned its rules without being taught them, and survived 7 years at the center of something that would have broken a softer person. But surviving alone, pregnant, in a city where she knew no one, with the constant low-grade awareness that the people who wanted to use her children as weapons were somewhere behind her? That was a different category of hard. She found a midwife through Beth's network, a woman named Carla, who worked in a sliding-scale clinic near Hawthorne and asked no questions about surnames or addresses. She found work that could be done remotely, contract paralegal work, document review, the kind of grinding legal labor that paid modestly and required only a laptop and a VPN. She bought the laptop with cash. She rerouted her digital footprint through a series of accounts she had set up specifically to frustrate anyone running a search. She was careful. She was relentlessly, exhaustingly careful. And she was lonely in a way she hadn't anticipated, which was the kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself as loneliness, but disguises itself as routine. Get up. Make tea. Work 3 hours. Eat something. Walk to the corner store and back. Work another 2 hours. Sleep badly. Repeat. The apartment smelled like dry cleaning solvent when the wind came from the wrong direction. The parking lot outside her window had a light that buzzed every 3rd night starting around 2 a.m., and she stopped being able to sleep through it by January. She called Beth twice a month. Those conversations were short and careful. Beth knew better than to ask where she was, and Vivian knew better than to give anything that could be traced. But just hearing a familiar voice, one that existed in the life before all of this, was something. It was enough. She let herself think about her children. She did that in the quiet hours, usually early morning before the city noise built up. She would lie still with her hands on her stomach, and she would talk to them in a low voice, not quite whispering, telling them things she wasn't sure they could hear but felt compelled to say anyway. She told them their names. She had decided by February, lying awake at 2 a.m. with the parking lot light buzzing. Mia and Leo. She told them she was going to figure it out. She told them that their father was not a bad man, that she had loved him fiercely and without reservation for 7 years, that she believed, though she could not prove it, that someone had taken that love and used it against both of them like a blade. She told them she was going to find out who. Not now. Now the only job was to keep them safe, to keep them hidden, to get them here in the world whole and breathing and untouched by the violence that had defined their parents' lives. But after. She was going to find out who had burned everything down, and she was going to make sure it didn't stay buried. Mia came first, on a night in late April, when a spring rainstorm was hammering the city so hard the parking lot outside turned into a shallow lake. Leo arrived 4 minutes later, screaming with an intensity that Carla said was exceptional, even by her standards. Both healthy, both present, both completely real in a way that everything else in Vivian's life had stopped feeling. She held them in the small room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and the lavender candle Carla had lit on the windowsill. She had moved the birth to a house Carla used for home births, a bungalow in Selwood with thick walls and a neighbor who minded her own business. And for the first time in 9 months, she did not feel afraid. She felt something else entirely, something she did not have a clean word for, a kind of fierce, scorched earth love that she recognized as the most dangerous thing she had ever felt, because she knew with absolute certainty that she would burn the entire world down before she let anything happen to these two people who had arrived at 4 minutes past midnight on an April night in a city they hadn't asked to be born in. Damian Moretti did not know his children existed. As far as anyone in New York was concerned, Vivian Carter had miscarried in the first trimester, which was the story Beth had quietly circulated through a mutual contact, carefully, with just enough grief in the telling to make it credible. Vivian had okayed this lie. It had felt like a necessary cruelty, the kind of choice that would require accounting someday, but not today. Today, there were only two small faces and the rain against the window and the specific weight of two separate human beings who trusted her completely. That would have to be enough. She walked out the side door onto the cross street rather than back onto Burnside, and she took a route home that involved 3 unnecessary turns and a stop inside a hardware store where she spent 4 minutes pretending to look at outlet covers while watching through the front window. He didn't follow her. Or if he did, he was better at it than she was at spotting it, which was possible. Possible and terrifying. She called Beth that night from a burner she had bought 3 months ago specifically for emergencies. "Someone's watching," she said, without preamble, when Beth picked up. A long pause. "You sure?" "No, but I can't afford to be unsure." "How long?" "Today was the first I noticed, which means, if they're good, longer." "Do you need to move?" She looked across the apartment at the 2 bassinets she had set up side by side against the wall where the morning light came in, where Mia and Leo were sleeping with the absolute trust of people who had no idea the world was watching. Her throat tightened. "Not yet," she said. "Let me see what moves first." Oh. What moved first was news from New York. She had been monitoring it carefully, not through any channel that could be traced back to her, but through a network of public sources, court records, and a single contact she trusted implicitly, a woman named Diane, who had been her closest friend during her marriage, who had managed to stay neutral when everything fell apart, and who had been feeding her carefully stripped information every few weeks via an email address that existed only for that purpose. The Moretti empire was bleeding. Diane's messages had been escalating in alarm for the past 2 months. 3 senior lieutenants removed from their positions in a span of 6 weeks. 2 of Damian's most trusted associates dead, one in what was officially ruled a car accident, and one in what was ruled a mugging in Midtown that no credible detective would look at for more than 30 seconds before calling it a hit. A shipment out of Newark intercepted by the Ricci family, which should not have been possible because only 4 people knew that route. Someone inside the Moretti organization was dismantling it from the inside, methodically, with the patience of someone who had been planning this for a long time. And in her most recent email, sent on a Tuesday with the subject line that said, "Only re-weather," Diane had written 3 sentences that Vivian read 4 times before she closed the laptop. "He thinks it's you, all of it." The lawyer who handles his internal security apparently pulled records that show communication patterns that look like coordination with Ricci assets. He's not sleeping. Vivian sat with that for a long time. Someone had built a frame around her so precisely that even the man who had loved her for 7 years, who knew her, who had watched her navigate his world with the kind of competence that should have been evidence of loyalty, even that man was looking at the evidence and seeing a betrayal that had never happened. Which meant whoever was doing this was very good, and very close to Damian. And they didn't know about Mia and Leo. Or they did know, and they hadn't moved yet, and that was somehow worse. She was feeding Leo at 2 in the morning. He was the difficult sleeper, had been since the first week, waking every 2.5 hours with an expression of profound injustice. When she heard the sound, it was subtle. The kind of sound that only registered because she was already at a level of vigilance that most people never reached and never had reason to. A creak on the exterior staircase. Not Mrs. Park. She never came up after 9. Not a neighbor. The apartment next to hers had been vacant for a month. A footstep. Then another. Then the silence that meant someone was trying not to make another one. Vivian set Leo down in the bassinet. He made one small sound of protest and then settled. And she moved to the kitchen in the dark, 3 years of muscle memory telling her feet where the floorboards didn't creak. She took the phone from the counter. She took the go bag from under the sink. She had packed it the day after the coffee shop incident and refreshed it twice since then. She positioned herself against the wall beside the door and waited. The handle moved. It moved slowly, the way handles moved when someone on the other side was testing resistance rather than trying to open it. Then it stopped. A pause of about 8 seconds. Then, not a knock, not a call, nothing that would bring Mrs. Park upstairs. A voice, very low, barely above the ambient sound of the city outside. Vivian. She stopped breathing. She knew that voice. She had known it for 7 years. She had fallen asleep to it, and woken to it, and argued with it, and loved it in ways she did not have adequate language for, even now, even after everything. Damien Moretti was standing outside her door, and in the bassinet across the room, Mia made a small sound in her sleep. Just a breath, just a murmur. And Vivian pressed herself harder against the wall and thought, in the space of that single second, about every decision she had made in the past 9 months and whether any of them had been enough. The handle moved again. She didn't open the door. That was the first decision, made in the space of half a breath while Damien's voice was still dissolving into the walls around her. She didn't open it, and she didn't speak, and she pressed herself flat against the plaster and held completely still while her heart did something ugly and arrhythmic inside her chest. Mia shifted in the bassinet. A small sound, not a cry, just the unconscious noise of a sleeping infant adjusting to some internal weather. And it landed in the silence of the apartment like a stone dropped into still water. On the other side of the door, nothing moved. Then, "I know you're in there." His voice was low. Controlled in the way it was always controlled, that particular register that meant he was working to keep something contained that wanted very badly to come out. She had learned to read the differences. Anger sounded like ice. Fear, the rare time she had heard it, sounded like the moment before ice cracked. This sounded like ice cracking. "I'm not here to drag you back," he said. "I need you to open the door." She looked across the room. Leo was still asleep. Mia had settled again, one small fist pressed against her cheek. The go-bag was over Vivian's shoulder. The phone was in her left hand with Beth's number 3 taps away. She thought about everything she had built in the last 9 months. The discipline, the invisibility, the life she had constructed from nothing and sustained through sheer grinding will. She thought about how completely it had just collapsed. Then she unlocked the door. She kept the chain on, opened it 4 inches, enough to see his face in the dim light of the stairwell. And what she saw there stopped something in her mid-breath. He looked like a man who had not slept in weeks. The angles of his face were sharper than she remembered, like the weight had come off somewhere it shouldn't have, and there were shadows under his eyes that had the specific quality of exhaustion that goes past tired into something structural. His jacket was good. It was always a good jacket, but the shirt beneath it was rumpled in a way Damien Moretti's shirts were never rumpled. He looked at her face through the 4-inch gap, and something moved through his expression that she couldn't name. "You look," he started. "Don't." Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "How did you find me?" "Financial pattern in the Connecticut account. It took 8 months and 2 analysts I trust completely." A beat. "Apparently you're very good at this." "I had motivation." "Vivian, how many people know where you are right now?" He blinked. The question had surprised him, which meant he hadn't expected her to be thinking tactically. That was his first mistake, and it irritated her that even now, even after everything, he was still capable of underestimating her. "2, he said, "my driver and my head of security." "Carlo?" "Carlo's dead," he said it flatly. 6 weeks ago. They made it look like a stroke." She absorbed that. Carlo Benedetti had been with Damien for 18 years. He had driven her to the hospital once when she'd had a migraine so severe she couldn't see straight. He had called her Mrs. Moretti with a particular formality that had always felt like respect rather than protocol. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I need to come in." "Give me one reason I should let you." He held her gaze through the gap. The stairwell light above him buzzed faintly. The same frequency as the parking lot light outside her window, she noted absurdly. And his face was half in shadow. "Because whoever set you up," he said, "just tried to kill our driver on the BQE 3 hours ago. And before Sal lost consciousness in the ambulance, he said one word." He paused. "Portland." The chain came off. She made him sit at the kitchen table where she could see his hands. She kept the go bag on the counter. She did not offer him anything, not water, not coffee, none of the automatic hospitality that 7 years of marriage had made reflex. And he didn't ask. He sat with his forearms on the table and looked at the apartment with the particular expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew. His eyes moved to the bassinets. They stopped there. Vivian watched him look at his children for the first time. She had prepared for this moment in the abstract, had run it through her mind 100 different ways, imagined 100 different versions of his face when it happened. None of the versions she had imagined looked like this. He was very still, the kind of still that wasn't calm but was the thing that lived underneath all the control when the control was working too hard. 2, he said. Not a question. His voice was different, stripped of something. Mia and Leo. She stayed where she was, standing between him and the bassinets with a positioning that was not subtle. They're 5 months old. He looked at her. His jaw was tight. You told me you miscarried. I told Beth. Beth told your world. I never said a word to you directly. That's a distinction that matters, she said. Yes, it does. He looked back at the bassinets. Leo was beginning to stir. He had an internal clock that Vivian had come to think of as both impressive and tyrannical. And Damien watched the small movements with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Raw was the word. It was a raw expression on a face that had spent decades learning to show nothing. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't. Vivian, I didn't know, and He stopped, pressed his mouth shut, looked at the table. When he looked back up, the rawness was still there, but there was something else underneath it, harder. I need you to understand that everything I believed about you, what I was told, what the evidence showed. Someone built it, she said. I know, I've known for months. That landed visibly. He straightened slightly. How much do you know? I know it's someone inside your circle, someone with access to your financial architecture and your communication lines. Someone patient enough to have been planning this before our marriage ended. Probably long before. She crossed her arms. I know the Ricci intercepts were too clean. The routing numbers in my account were planted. And I know whoever it is has been stripping your organization from the inside while you were looking at me. He was quiet for a moment. You've been running intelligence from here. I've been surviving from here. The intelligence was a side effect. He almost said something. She could see it. The reflex of a man who had spent 20 years being the most informed person in any room, confronted with the fact that his ex-wife had assembled a clearer picture of his own crisis from a furnished apartment above a dry cleaning business than he had from inside the empire itself. He pulled it back. Who do you think it is? He asked instead. She had thought about whether to tell him, had thought about it seriously for the past 3 weeks since Diane's last message had made the outline of it clear enough to see. The risk of telling him. The risk of not telling him. The specific vulnerability of the position she was now in. Her location known, her children present, a man she did not fully trust sitting at her kitchen table with access to people and resources that dwarfed anything she could deploy. But Leo was fully awake now, making the specific preliminary sounds that meant escalation was coming in the next 30 seconds, and Mia would follow within minutes, and there was something grotesque about having this conversation while her children needed feeding, and Damien Moretti was learning he was a father in real time. Give me 10 minutes, she said. He nodded once. She went to Leo first. She fed them with her back half turned to Damien, angled so she could see him in her peripheral vision while she worked. He watched. He didn't look away, and he didn't pretend to look away. And after a few minutes, she stopped being aware of it in the uncomfortable way and started being aware of it in a different way. The way she had been aware of his attention in the early years, which had always felt like being taken seriously by someone who took very few things seriously. She hated that she noticed that. When Mia and Leo were settled again, she turned back to the table and sat down across from him. The kitchen light was low. She had never replaced the overhead bulb, had been living by a lamp in the corner for 3 months, and it made the conversation feel oddly private, intimate in a way she didn't want it to be. Luca, she said. Damien's face did not change. That was significant. A man who had not considered it would have reacted. A man who had already dismissed it would have reacted differently. The complete absence of reaction meant something had just confirmed itself. Tell me why, he said quietly. Because the evidence against me was too perfect. It accounted for things that would have required knowledge of our private financial conversations. Things that happened in rooms where there were never more than 4 people and 2 of them were us. She held his gaze. Luca was at the table for both of those conversations. I remember because he argued against the Connecticut transfer specifically. At the time, I thought it was just Luca being Luca. He argued against everything I brought to the table. Now I think he was building a record. A long silence. He's been with me for 11 years, Damien said. I know. He watched our wedding. I know. He's the one who brought me the initial evidence about the Ricci leak. He's the one who identified the routing pattern in your account. Damien stopped. Something was happening behind his eyes. A slow, brutal recalibration of 11 years' worth of history. She had done the same recalibration herself, over months, in this apartment. She did not envy him doing it in real time. He brought me the evidence. Yes. He told me about the wire transfer. He found what he put there to be found, Vivian said. Not unkindly. As factual as she could make it. Damien stood up abruptly. Not from anger, she recognized the difference, but from the specific need to move that came when the body decided it couldn't hold still anymore. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the parking lot and the buzzing light and the wet pavement of the September street beyond. His shoulders were held in a way that looked like control, but was actually the frame a man put around himself when he was trying not to come apart. He's been running operations, he said. Not to her. More like talking to the window, to the version of the last 11 years that was rearranging itself behind his eyes. For the past 4 months, I've been pulling back, trying to identify the leak, and I pulled Luca closer into the center because I trusted him. I gave him more access. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I handed him the keys and asked him to find the person stealing from me. Damien. He turned around. His face was different now. The rawness from earlier had solidified into something harder and quieter and more genuinely dangerous. She had seen that look before. It was the look he wore when a decision was final. I need to go back, he said. If you go back now, he'll know I'm alive. He'll know the children are alive. She kept her voice level. Right now we have one advantage. He doesn't know what you know. The moment you go back to New York and he reads your face, that's gone. I'm not going to let him continue to. I'm not asking you to let him do anything. I'm asking you to be smart about it. She stood up. They were the same height within an inch. She had always noticed this, the physical parity between them that felt like a metaphor for everything else. You came here without telling your organization. You have until morning before someone notices. We use that time to think. We don't move until we know what we're moving into. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been doing this alone for 9 months, he said. Yes. Running everything, managing the risk, keeping them safe. He glanced toward the bassinets. By yourself. Also, yes. I didn't. He stopped again. The word he'd started with was too small for what he was trying to say, and she could see him recognizing that, discarding it, not finding a replacement. I owe you more than an apology. You do, she agreed. But that's a conversation for a different night. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. Right now, I need you to tell me everything that's happened in the last 4 months in detail. Every operation that failed, every contact that went dark, every decision Luca was part of. She put her hands flat on the table. And then we're going to figure out how to take him apart. He sat back down. He talked for 90 minutes. It was worse than she had estimated. She had been working from incomplete information, Diane's careful dispatches, public records, the careful reading of court filings, and corporate structures that she'd managed remotely, and the full picture, assembled from Damien's account with all the internal details she'd been missing, was significantly more methodical than she had allowed herself to believe. Luca Romano had been positioning for this for at minimum 2 years, possibly longer. He had built a parallel structure inside the Moretti organization, a web of loyalties purchased quietly, over time, through favors and money and the specific kind of influence that accrues to a man who is always in the room when decisions are made. He had not moved against Damien directly. He had moved against the things that held Damien in place, the trusted men, the secure roots, the marriage that had given Damien something to protect beyond the empire itself, and which Luca had apparently understood, before Damien had, was a vulnerability that could be exploited. He knew, Vivian said when Damien finished. Knew what? That you loved me. She said it plainly, without any particular emotion, a clinical observation. That was the lever. Everything else was architecture. The actual mechanism was the one thing that could make you stop thinking and start reacting. She looked at him. He used it perfectly. Damien said nothing for a moment. You're not wrong. I know I'm not wrong. She looked at the note she had been making on the back of a utility envelope, the only paper within reach, while he talked. The Ricci connection is fabricated, but the Ricci family is real, and they've benefited from what's happened. That means Luca's been feeding them actual operational intelligence alongside the manufactured evidence. He's built a real relationship with them while framing me for it. She tapped the pen against the table, which means we can't expose him through the Ricci angle without implicating a real information exchange that he's been conducting in your name. He's been selling my operations to my enemies and signing my name to the invoices. Essentially. So the play isn't through the Riccis. The play is through whoever inside your organization hasn't been flipped yet. People who were loyal to you before Luca started buying and who've been pushed to the margins as he consolidated. She looked up. Who's left? Genuinely. Not people you assume are still yours, people you can verify. He thought about it. Really thought. Which she could tell because he went quiet in a specific way. The thinking quiet rather than the calculating quiet. 3, maybe 4. Names. He gave them. She wrote them down. She looked at the list. Danny Reese, she said. He was your first hire, before Luca. Before Luca. And Luca's never fully trusted him because Reese came up with you personally, rather than through any channel Luca could influence. Reese and Luca have never liked each other, Damien confirmed. I always thought it was just... He stopped. I thought it was just personality. It wasn't personality. Reese couldn't be bought, and Luca knew it. She set the pen down. Reese is how we do this, but not tonight. Tonight we... The phone buzzed on the counter. Not her personal phone. The burner. The one with only one contact. She was across the room in 4 steps. She looked at the screen. Beth. Someone asking around your neighborhood. 2 men, not police. She showed it to Damien. She watched him read it. Watched his face go from exhausted to alert in less time than it took to draw a breath. That particular shift she had witnessed a dozen times. The flipping of some internal switch that turned the man into something else. Something colder and more efficient and considerably more dangerous. How long have they been watching this location? He asked. I don't know. I made one of them at a coffee shop 8 days ago. I didn't move because I thought I had more time. She was already looking at the door. At the bassinets, at the distance between them. I was wrong. Back exit? Alley. Connects to the next block. Car? 2 blocks east, gray Civic, 2019. He was already standing. I'll carry them. You drive. She looked at him. The man who had divorced her 10 months ago because someone showed him a paper trail and he had chosen not to question it. The man standing in her kitchen at 3 in the morning who had traveled to Portland because a driver whispered one word from an ambulance and Damien had gotten on a plane. If we go out that door together, she said, there is no version of this where we come back separately. You understand that? I understand. I mean it, Damien. If you decide somewhere between here and New York that you still think there's a version of this story where I'm not on your side, if you wake up tomorrow and Luca shows you something new and you let yourself believe it, I will disappear again, and you will never find us. Not in 8 months. Not in 8 years. His eyes held hers. I understand. Say it like you mean it. I was wrong, he said. Quiet. Absolute. The voice he used when something was final. Everything I was shown, everything I believed, it was constructed to make me wrong. I know that now. And I know that every day you spent in this apartment alone, keeping my children alive without a single resource from me, is something I spent the last 10 months causing. He held her gaze without flinching. I understand what I owe, and I'm not going anywhere. She held the look for 3 more seconds. Then she went to the bassinets. Mia was awake, watching the ceiling with the calm, unreadable attention that had been her default expression since birth. Leo was asleep again. He operated in short, intense bursts. Vivian lifted Mia first, and when she turned around, Damien was there. Close. Hands open, waiting, She put her daughter in his arms. She watched him hold Mia for the first time, watched the adjustment, the instinctive shift of balance, the way his arms recalibrated around the small weight, with a care that looked almost painful in its intensity. Mia looked up at him with her mother's dark eyes, unimpressed and utterly trusting, and Damien looked back at her with an expression that Vivian would carry with her for a very long time. Then she picked up Leo, grabbed the go bag, and moved to the back door. "Stay behind me until we're in the alley," she said. "Keep low past the third window on the left. Mrs. Park doesn't sleep and she doesn't need to see this." She cracked the door and listened. Rain, street noise, a car 2 blocks over. Nothing wrong. "When we get to the car, you put them in the back with me and you drive. Do not use the highway. Surface streets to the bridge." "I know how to move unseen." "I know, but this is my city and I know the streets." She looked at him one more time over her shoulder. "And Damien? If anyone comes out of those shadows in the next 30 seconds, you get the children to the car and you don't stop for anything." She didn't wait for an answer. She pushed through the door into the wet alley and moved toward whatever came next, with her son against her chest and the sound of Damien's footsteps 3 paces behind her, steady and close, and, despite everything, despite all of it, exactly where she needed them to be. They were halfway to the corner when the first shadow detached itself from the wall ahead, and a man's voice said very calmly, "Mrs. Moretti, Mr. Romano would like a word." Vivian stopped walking. The man in the alley was not alone. A second shape materialized from the doorway recess 8 feet to his left, bigger, quieter, with the specific stillness of someone trained to hold position until the moment it mattered. Both of them were wearing dark clothing. Neither of them was holding a weapon visibly, which meant the weapons were present and she simply couldn't see them yet. Behind her, she felt Damien go still. Not the stillness of fear. The other kind. "Step back from the door," the first man said. He had a New York accent, outer burrow, flattened vowels. He was looking at Damien, not at her. "We're not here for a problem. Mr. Romano wants to—" "You said that," Damien said. "Sir, who gave you this address?" A pause. The man glanced at his partner. That glance lasted half a second and contained an entire conversation. The specific exchange of people who have been told what to do, but not what to do if the situation doesn't go the way they were briefed. "Mr. Romano has the address," the first man said carefully. "How long?" "I don't have that information." Damien's voice dropped a register. "How long has Luca Romano had this address?" Another pause. Longer. The second man shifted his weight slightly, and Vivian tracked the movement with every nerve she had while holding Leo against her chest with both arms, and calculating the distance to the alley's cross street, 22 feet, past the first man, between the two of them if she angled right, into the cross street where the Wednesday night foot traffic would create enough chaos to— But she had Leo, and Damien had Mia, and neither of those calculations worked the same way when you were carrying an infant. 6 days, the first man said. 6 days. She had spotted the watcher 8 days ago. He had been there before that. Which meant the moment she flagged the surveillance, the moment she called Beth and went to ground in her own apartment, Luca's people had already been 2 steps ahead. "He knows we're here," she said quietly, to Damien's left shoulder. Not loud enough for the men to hear. "He's known where you were for 6 days and he didn't move," Damien said, same register. Which means he needed something. He needed to wait for something. He needed to wait for you, she thought. He needed to see if you'd come. "Mr. Moretti." The first man took 1 step forward, careful, hands visible, open at his sides, the deliberate body language of someone trying very hard to look non-threatening, which was itself a kind of threat. "Mr. Romano is requesting a meeting. Tonight. He says he has information that directly concerns—" The man's eyes went to the bundle in Damien's arms, just for a moment, but long enough. "The situation." Leo made a sound against Vivian's chest. Small, questioning. Everything in her went cold. "He knows about the children," she said. Damien said nothing. His jaw was a locked door. "He's known about the children," she said again, and this time it wasn't shock. Shock had lasted about 4 seconds, and was already burning off into something cleaner and harder. That's what he was waiting for. He was waiting to confirm they existed. He needed to see Mrs. Moretti. The second man spoke for the first time. His voice was different, quieter, less rehearsed, with an edge that the first man's didn't have. "Please come with us. Mr. Romano asked me to tell you specifically that the children will not be harmed. Tonight. Tonight." The qualifier landed like a blade. Damien took one step forward. The first man put a hand up. Not aggressive, purely reflexive. And Damien stopped. But the quality of his stillness had changed into something that both men in the alley visibly registered. She saw the second man's hand move slightly toward his jacket. "Tell me where," Damien said. "Up." They took them to a warehouse near the waterfront, industrial northeast Portland, the kind of neighborhood that had been earmarked for development for a decade and hadn't gotten there yet. Empty lots, a few commercial operations that kept odd hours. The specific geography of a place where no one paid close attention to what came and went at 3 in the morning. The car ride took 11 minutes. Vivian counted. She sat in the back with Leo and Mia in her lap and the go bag at her feet, and she looked at the back of the driver's head and committed the route to memory as a reflex, even though she understood with complete clarity that if this went wrong, a memorized route home was not going to save them. Damien sat beside her. He did not touch her, and she did not touch him. But she was intensely aware of the physical fact of him, the weight and warmth of him in the confined space, in a way that felt like some ancient animal part of her brain was trying to triangulate safety against threat and landing somewhere complicated. She looked down at Mia, who was asleep again. Leo was watching the passing lights through the window with the focused attention he brought to most things, tracking them as they moved in a way that the pediatric literature said was developmentally impressive for 5 months, and that Vivian had always found slightly unnerving, as if he was cataloging information for later use. She thought, "I will not let anything happen to you." She had thought this many times before, and it had always been a promise. Right now it felt more like a negotiation with circumstances that were not listening. The warehouse had interior lighting, industrial floods, the kind that cast everything in flat white without shadow. And it smelled like salt water and machine oil and the faint ghost of fish, which meant it had been a working operation at some point and hadn't been for long enough that the smell was memory rather than current activity. Folding chairs had been set up near the center. A table. A man standing with his back to them when they entered, looking at something on his phone with the careful attention of someone managing several things simultaneously. He turned around when the door closed. Luca Romano was 51 years old and built like a man who had started life physically and managed to preserve most of it through the sheer momentum of a disciplined routine. He had a broad, honest-looking face. That was the thing about Luca that Vivian had always found slightly unsettling. The way his face looked trustworthy, in the way faces in old photographs looked trustworthy. Heavy-lidded dark eyes. A jaw that belonged on something older and more immovable. He was dressed simply. Dark trousers, a gray sweater, no jacket. He looked like someone who had been called from home in the middle of the night rather than someone who had orchestrated this. He looked at Damien first, then at Vivian, then at the children with an expression she studied very carefully and classified as deliberately neutral, the expression of a man who had decided in advance how he was going to look when he looked at them. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "I wasn't given a compelling alternative," Damien said. Luca nodded slowly. "Sit down, both of you. There's no—" He gestured at the men behind them. "This isn't an interrogation. I need you to hear something, and I need you to hear it without reacting before I finish. Can you do that?" "Talk," Damien said. He didn't sit. Neither did Vivian. Luca studied them for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the table and sat down himself, which was either a de-escalation gesture or a power move, depending on how you read it. The deliberate comfort of a man who controlled the room. He set his phone on the table face down. "The Ricci leak was mine," he said. "All of it." The room was very quiet. The financial records, the routing pattern through Vivian's account, the communication intercepts. I built all of it over 14 months. I brought it to you. I watched you make the decision to end your marriage based on material I manufactured. He said this with the same tone a man might use to describe a business transaction that had been completed satisfactorily. No apology in it. No performance of remorse, just the flat, procedural delivery of someone who had moved past the question of whether what he did was wrong and had been living for some time in the territory of what came next. "I need you to know that I'm telling you this because the situation has changed, and there are things you need to understand that you can't understand without knowing where you started from." Damien's voice came out barely above a whisper. 11 years. Yes. Carlo. Luca held his gaze. Carlo had figured out the financial structure 6 weeks before he died. He came to me first. He thought I should know. Something shifted in Luca's expression. I told you it was a stroke because there was no version of that conversation that ended any other way. The sound Damien made was not a word. It was something lower and more fundamental than language. The sound of a foundation cracking somewhere deep, somewhere that had been load-bearing for a very long time. Vivian put her hand on his arm without thinking about it. He didn't shake it off. Then why are we here? She said to Luca. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. If you've built all of this, if you've been running this for 2 years, why bring us to a warehouse at 3 in the morning to confess? Luca looked at her. Because it didn't work the way it was supposed to. Explain that. He leaned forward, both forearms on the table. The plan was elegant. I remove Vivian. Damien loses the one stabilizing influence in his life that isn't the empire itself. And a man without something to protect outside the work becomes brittle in a specific way. He over-centralizes. He pulls the circle tight. He stops trusting the periphery and starts trusting the center. He paused. The center was me. I was positioned to absorb everything he pulled back to himself. Within 18 months, I would have had sufficient control to broker a new arrangement with the Riccis that expanded both our operations and ended a 30-year conflict that's been bleeding us both for no reason that made sense anymore. You were going to merge us with the Riccis, Damien said. I was going to make us something large enough that the word rival stopped applying. Luca's voice carried something she recognized. The specific conviction of a man who believed, genuinely and completely, in the rightness of his own vision. You never could see it, Damien. You were always fighting a war you inherited from your father instead of asking whether the war still needed to be fought. You killed Carlo to consolidate a business plan. I removed an obstacle to a peace that would have benefited 400 people who work for us and their families. He said it without flinching. Every decision I made was toward that end, including manufacturing evidence against my wife. Your wife was the variable I couldn't control. For the first time, Luca's voice carried something that sounded like genuine frustration. She was too close to you. You listened to her in ways you didn't listen to anyone else. She saw patterns I needed you not to see. I needed her gone, and I needed you to be the one who sent her away, because if she simply disappeared, you would have burned the world down looking, and I would have lost everything I'd built. He looked at Vivian. I underestimated how completely you would disappear, and I underestimated, his eyes moved to the children, the other variable. You didn't know about the twins until recently, Vivian said. I didn't know about them until 5 weeks ago. One of my contacts in Connecticut ran a routine financial sweep and found the Reyes account. He said it with the matter-of-fact precision of someone reading an audit. When I understood what it meant, everything changed. Why? He looked at her directly. Because children change the math. A man protecting an empire can be managed. A man protecting an empire and his children is a different problem entirely. He paused. And because the Ricci family found out. The sentence dropped into the room and just sat there. Vivian heard her own heartbeat. How? She said. I have a leak, Luca said, and the flatness in his voice was the first thing she had heard from him that sounded like something other than control. Someone inside my operation has been feeding information to Marco Ricci for the past 8 weeks. I don't know who. I've been trying to identify them, which is why I haven't moved on you directly. I needed to understand the full exposure before I acted. He spread his hands on the table. Marco Ricci knows the children exist. He knows they're Damien's heirs. And Marco Ricci's position on Moretti heirs has been consistent for 30 years. The cold that moved through Vivian was different from anything she had felt before. It wasn't fear in the ordinary sense. Fear was something with texture, something you could push against. This was simpler and more absolute. She held Leo tighter without making a conscious decision to do so. Damien stepped forward. Where's Ricci now? New York. But he has people here. Luca looked up at him. He's had people here for 72 hours. I've been tracking them, which is why I moved tonight. Tomorrow morning, I lose the window. You're asking us to trust you, Vivian said. I'm telling you the situation. His eyes moved between them. What you do with it is your decision. But I want you to understand clearly, the Ricci exposure is my fault, and I'm aware of that. And I'm telling you about it because there are only two ways this ends. Either we handle it together tonight, or the Ricci problem handles all of us separately, and nothing I spent 2 years building matters. Damien looked at him for a long time. Give me one reason, he said, why I shouldn't kill you where you're sitting. Because I know where Ricci's people are, Luca said simply. And you don't. And you have... His eyes went to the children one more time. Approximately 3 hours before that stops being a meaningful difference. The silence stretched. Vivian could feel Damien's arm under her hand, the tension in it, coiled and enormous and barely held. She understood what he was working through. She had her own version of it, running faster and with less sentiment. The calculation of what they actually needed versus what they deserved to take out of this man right now. They needed the information. Everything else was secondary. Tell us where they are, she said. Luca nodded once. He reached for his phone. That was when the warehouse's east-facing window exploded inward. The first shot took out the overhead flood on the left side of the room and dropped half the space into shadow. Vivian was already moving, not toward the door, toward a concrete support column 12 feet to her right, the kind of structural element that stopped bullets. And she knew it stopped bullets because she had thought about things like this in a way she never had before. She became the person she had spent the last 9 months becoming. She hit the column with her shoulder and pressed Leo against her chest and dropped into a crouch with her back against the concrete, and she looked across the room. Damien was behind the table, so he had flipped it in one motion, the phone and everything on it scattering across the floor, and he had Mia pressed flat against his chest with one arm, while his other hand had materialized a weapon from somewhere that she hadn't tracked, and was watching the blown-out window with the focused, depersonalized attention of someone who had done this before. Luca's two men were shouting. One of them went down, not from a shot, from diving, and the other had his weapon out and was moving to the left wall, away from the window's angle of exposure. Luca himself had not moved from his chair. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table that no longer existed, just flat on his thighs now, on the surface of air where the table had been. And he was looking at the window with an expression that Vivian, from her position behind the column, could only partially see. It was not panic, it was not fear, it was calculation. Romano, Damien said from behind where the table had been, low and controlled. How many? At least 4 outside, possibly 6. Luca stood up slowly. There's a door in the back wall behind the shelving unit. It leads to the loading dock. From the dock you can reach the south fence. And you know that because I chose this location, Luca said. He straightened his sweater with one precise tug at the hem. And I chose it knowing that Marco Ricci's people follow patterns, and the pattern for this neighborhood is to cover the main access and the north perimeter. Another shot came through the window, high, clipping the ceiling, and he did not flinch. The south is clear for approximately 4 minutes. You planned an exit, Vivian said. I plan everything. He looked at her across the room. In the half-light with the shadows wrong and the smell of cordite starting to collect in the air, his honest-looking face looked like something else entirely. The children need to leave now, through the back. I'll hold the front with my men. Why, Damien said. Because I started this. Because Carlo is dead because of me, and you lost a year of your marriage, and your children grew up for 5 months without their father. And all of that traces back to a plan that I believed was right, and that has resulted in this. He gestured at the blown-out window, at the darkness outside, at the 2 sleeping and 1 now crying infant in the arms of their parents in a waterfront warehouse in Portland, which is not what I planned. He looked at Damien directly. Get them out. We finish our conversation later. Damien looked at him for 1 more second. Then he looked at Vivian. She was already moving toward the back wall. The shelving unit was heavy metal, the kind used for industrial storage, and it was bolted to the wall, but there was a gap on the left side wide enough to move through if she turned sideways. She went through first with Leo, felt the cooler air of the back corridor, heard Damien come through behind her with Mia. Behind them, from the main floor, she heard shouting and 2 shots fired in rapid succession and the particular acoustic quality of a small war being conducted on their behalf by a man she had every reason to hate. The loading dock door was exactly where Luca had said it was. She hit the bar handle with her forearm and pushed through into the night air, cold, salt-heavy, the waterfront smell dense and immediate, and ran. She was 30 feet from the south fence when she heard a sound behind her that stopped her mid-stride. Not gunfire, not pursuit, a child's voice. Not Leo, not Mia. She turned around. Damien had stopped 8 feet back. He was standing completely still, and the reason he was standing still was that a man had stepped from the shadow of the dock's overhang and was holding Mia against his chest with one arm and a gun against the side of her daughter's head with the other hand. And Mia was awake and looking around with her dark eyes, with the calm incomprehension of someone who did not yet have the language for what was happening to her. The man was young, late 20s. He looked more frightened than Damien did, which was somehow the most terrifying thing about him. A frightened man with a gun and a child was a volatile chemistry that no amount of tactical thinking fully accounted for. "Tell him to drop it," the young man said. His voice cracked on the second word. Vivian did not move, did not breathe. Damien had his weapon half raised and then it stopped, and the arm that held it went rigid, and the look on his face was something she had never seen before and would never forget. Not the calculation, not the control, not the coldness. Something that had stripped all of that away and left just the bare, essential fact of a man looking at his daughter and understanding for the first time in a physical, irreversible way exactly what he had almost lost without ever knowing it was there. "Put the gun down," the young man said. His arm tightened around Mia. She made a small sound. "Put it down or I—" "You're not going to hurt her," Damien said. Quiet. Absolute. "Because if you hurt her, the last thing you do on this earth is hurt her. You understand me. That's not a threat. That's the only true thing I'm capable of telling you right now." The young man's eyes moved to Vivian, to Leo in her arms. Back to Damien. His hand was shaking. Vivian looked at her daughter in the arms of a stranger with a shaking hand and felt something move through her that she had no name for. Something that rearranged the fundamental architecture of who she was willing to be, what she was willing to do, how far past every line she had ever drawn she was willing to go to get Mia back into her arms. She took one step forward. "Hey," she said. Her voice was soft, even. The voice she used at 2 in the morning when Leo cried and she needed to bring him back from wherever frightened infants went when they cried. "Hey, look at me." The young man looked at her. "What's your name?" she said. A pause. "Doesn't matter. It matters to me." Another step. Damien had gone completely still in her peripheral vision. He understood what she was doing, or he was trusting that she was doing something, which was itself a decision she noted and put away for later. "You're scared, I can see that. And whoever sent you here told you this was going to go a certain way, and it isn't going that way. And you're standing here with a baby you didn't plan to be holding and a gun you don't want to fire." She stopped 6 feet from him. "I'm her mother. Let me take her." The gun trembled against Mia's temple. "I can't," he said. They sent you out here alone," Vivian said. "They left you at the south exit because they didn't think it mattered. You're not their priority. You're their contingency." She held his eyes. "Whatever they promised you for tonight, it's not worth this. You know that." His arm loosened by a fraction. Just a fraction. But she saw it. "Let me take her," she said again. Steady. 6 feet and a gun and a trembling hand between her and her daughter. He looked at the baby in his arms, at the small face looking up at him with absolute trust, and his arm came down. Vivian moved the remaining 6 feet in one motion and took Mia from him with both hands and stepped back and held her daughter against her chest and pressed her face into the warmth of Mia's hair and breathed once, just once, before she heard Damien move behind her and the sound of the young man hitting the ground and the specific silence that followed. She didn't look. She held both her children and she stood in the dark by the south fence of a waterfront warehouse in Portland, while behind her a war she hadn't started was reaching the end of its first act. Then Damien's hand was on her shoulder. "South fence," he said, low, urgent. "Now." She went. But somewhere behind her in the warehouse she heard Luca Romano's voice rise once. Sharp, not a scream, the specific sound of a man issuing a command that had already come too late. And then a single shot. And then nothing. She didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But she ran, and Damien ran beside her, and their children were alive between them. And when they hit the fence, Damien went over first and reached back for her, and she handed him Leo, and then Mia, and then pulled herself over the cold metal with her palms scraping and her arms burning and dropped onto the other side into the wet grass. And she thought, this is not over. Whoever just fired that shot it either just saved them or just made everything that was coming immeasurably worse. They ran 4 blocks before Damien pulled her into the shadow of a loading dock overhang, and they stopped, both of them breathing hard, the wet September air coming in and out of their lungs in ragged pulls that fogged in the cold. Mia was crying, small, insistent, the cry that meant she was frightened without knowing what frightened meant. Leo was silent in Vivian's arms with his face pressed against her neck and his hand gripping the collar of her jacket with a strength that still surprised her every time, the specific fierce grip of someone who understood, on a level beneath language, that letting go was the wrong choice. Damien pressed his back against the corrugated metal wall and checked the weapon in his hand, the cylinder, the load, some private accounting she didn't follow, and then looked back the way they had come. Smoke was visible above the roofline 2 blocks over. Not much. A vehicle, maybe, or something inside the warehouse that had caught. The gunfire had stopped. That silence was not reassuring. "Luca," she said. "I don't know. The shot we heard, I don't know." He looked at her. His face was cut on the left cheekbone. She hadn't noticed it until now, the specific shine of fresh blood in the ambient light from the street beyond the dock. He didn't appear to know it was there. "We need a car. The Civic is still 2 blocks east of the apartment. If they had the apartment covered, they had the alley. They may not have had the street." He was already calculating, she could see it, the rapid, lateral problem-solving that had always been his most dangerous quality, the ability to triage information at speed without freezing. "We go around the block to the north, come at it from the opposite direction. And if it's covered, then we find another car." He held her gaze. "I'm not leaving you on foot with the children." She looked at him, the cut on his face, the way he was holding Mia against his chest with a grip that mirrored Leo's grip on her collar, fierce and decided and beyond negotiation. She had 9 months of practice at not depending on this man, and she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that the practice was over. "North," she said. They moved. The Civic was untouched. Either Luca's people had run a tighter perimeter than they'd managed at the warehouse, or Ricci's team had been operating with limited intel on her secondary assets. The car had been registered under the LLC, and the LLC was 3 entities deep under her mother's maiden name. She'd built it carefully, apparently carefully enough. She put the children in the back. Damien folded himself into the passenger seat, and she pulled out onto the empty street and drove east, away from the waterfront, toward the bridge. "Call Danny Reese," she said. He was already on it. The phone pressed to his ear, the other hand braced against the dash as she took a corner faster than was comfortable. 3 rings, 4. "Pick up," she said. 5. "Reese." Damien's voice, flat, urgent. "Listen to me. Don't talk. Don't say my name. Just listen." He waited 1 beat. "I'm alive. Vivian is alive. There was a situation tonight in Portland. Ricci people. Luca's warehouse. It's complicated, and I'll explain later. I need you to do 3 things right now." Another beat. "First, find out if Luca Romano is alive. Don't go near his people. Don't go near his location. Use the external contact we used for the Newark route, the one Luca doesn't know about. Second, I need a safe location in New York, not a Moretti property. Something clean, nothing connected to any standing operation. You'll know what I mean." A pause, and she could hear the faint sound of Reese's voice without being able to make out words. "Third, Marco Ricci. I need to know where he is tonight. Personal location, not business." Another pause, shorter. "No, no one else. Just you." He ended the call. She merged onto the bridge. Portland fell away behind them, the city lights reflected in the river below. "Reese is good," she said. Statement, not question. "Reese is the only person I'm certain of." He lowered the phone. "Which is a brutal thing to say about an organization I've spent 20 years building." She said nothing. Nothing. "Vivian, don't. I know what you need to say." She kept her eyes on the road. The bridge cables swept past above them in regular intervals, dark against the sky. "And I need you to wait until we're somewhere safe to say it, because if you say it right now, I won't be able to drive." He was quiet. She heard him exhale, long, controlled, the breath of a man reining something back. "Okay," he said. She drove. Reese called back 40 minutes later when they were on the highway heading south. Luca Romano was alive. Injured, two of Ricci's men had stayed on the warehouse floor and one of Luca's had been killed, which meant the firefight had been ugly in close quarters, and Luca had come out of it on the expensive side. He was at a location Reese described only as medical, off-grid, which in their world meant a surgeon who asked no questions and kept no records. He was expected to survive. The clean location was a house in Westchester, belonged to a retired accountant who had done legitimate work for one of Damien's legal entities 6 years ago and who owed him a favor he'd never collected. Reese had made the call and the house would be open. Marco Ricci was in Manhattan. The Ricci family's primary residence on the Upper East Side, which was a brownstone that had been in the family since the 1970s, and which was, by Reese's count, currently holding 8 people, including Ricci himself. 8, Damien said. 8 confirmed, possibly more. Any of the 4 who went into the warehouse in Portland. 2 of them are still in Portland. 1 is dead, 1 is your man in Westchester. A pause. The other 2 I can't locate yet. Keep looking. Damien ended the call and looked at Vivian. We need to go to New York. I know. The Westchester house first. Get the children settled. Get you somewhere I can... Get me somewhere safe. Yes. She heard the edge in her own voice and smoothed it deliberately. This was not the time. Who do we have in New York who isn't connected to Luca's network? Reese. 2 others I'm reasonably certain of. Tony Caruso, who's been running the Bronx operation independently for 6 years, and who Luca has actively disliked since 2019, and a woman named Mara Chen, who handles our financial compliance, and who I know. Luca tried to remove from her position twice, and I overruled him both times. He paused. I should have paid more attention to who he wanted gone. You couldn't have known. I should have... Damien, she glanced at him. That's also a conversation for later. Right now I need you thinking forward. He pressed his mouth shut, nodded once. 3 people, she said. Reese, Caruso, Chen, and Luca, if he survives and if we decide his information is worth more than what he's done. Luca, Damien said, and the word came out like something he was picking up off the floor to examine before deciding whether to throw it or keep it. He told us the truth tonight. He told us the truth when it was useful to him. That's not nothing. No, she agreed. It's not nothing. It's just not the same as trust. She drove through the dark with her children asleep in the back seat and the highway unreeling ahead of them and the whole weight of what was coming sitting in the car with them like a 4th passenger. And she thought about Marco Ricci and the brownstone on the Upper East Side and the 8 people Reese had counted. And she thought about her daughter in a stranger's arms in a Portland waterfront and the way her own hands had stopped shaking precisely when they most needed to. She was done running. She had been done since the moment she took Mia back from the young man with the shaking hand. She just hadn't said it out loud yet. The Westchester house was a colonial on 2 acres, set back from the road behind a screen of old maples that had gone orange in the September cold. The retired accountant, a quiet man named Gerald, who seemed to understand without being told that the less he saw the better, had left the porch light on and the key under the mat and himself conspicuously absent. She settled the twins in the master bedroom, which had a lock she could bolt from the inside. She fed them. She changed them. She sat on the edge of the bed in the yellow lamplight and looked at their faces. Mia already asleep again, Leo fighting it with everything he had as usual. And she let herself have 90 seconds of something she didn't try to name. It wasn't relief. Relief implied the danger was over. It was something smaller and more provisional. The specific feeling of a brief stillness inside a long storm. Then she went downstairs. Damien was at the kitchen table with Reese on speaker, a legal pad in front of him with notes in his own handwriting. He'd found the first aid kit under the kitchen sink and had cleaned the cut on his cheekbone without bothering to cover it. He looked up when she came in. Reese's voice was coming through the phone. Movement around the brownstone in the last 2 hours. 2 vehicles. Looks like a rotation. They know something went wrong in Portland. They know their people didn't come back, Damien said. Right. So Ricci's pulling his perimeter in. He's expecting contact. He'll expect me to come at him the way I always have, Damien said. Hard and from the front. It's the Moretti playbook and he's been reading it for 30 years. Vivian sat down across from him. She reached across and turned the legal pad toward her. She looked at what he'd written. Names, positions, locations. A rough diagram of the brownstone street layout from memory. He won't expect her, Reese said through the phone. A pause. No offense, Vivian. None taken, she said. He's right. Damien looked at her. No. Damien, absolutely not. Listen to me. She kept her voice even. Ricci's perimeter is set up for a Moretti approach. Men, vehicles, a frontal pressure that gives him time to move. He's not thinking about a woman he doesn't know is alive walking in through whatever angle he's left uncovered. She looked at the diagram. He doesn't know I'm with you. He doesn't know I'm in New York. As far as his intelligence goes, I'm a ghost. As far as his intelligence goes, his people tried to kill you 4 hours ago in Portland. His people tried to recover the children. They didn't confirm whether I survived. She met his eyes. That's a gap. And it's the only gap we have. You're not using me as anything. Her voice didn't rise, but something in it sharpened. I'm offering a capability you don't have any other way to get. That's different from being used. She held his gaze. I've been keeping us alive for 9 months without your help. I think I've earned the right to weigh in on how this ends. The kitchen was very quiet. From upstairs, faint and muffled by the floor between them, she could hear Leo begin to settle into sleep. Damien looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. Reese, he said finally, without breaking eye contact with her. What's the northeast access to the brownstone? A pause on the line, then, Service alley. No cameras on the alley itself. The building system covers the front entrance and the parking level. The alley connects to the next block through a maintenance gate. Damien looked at Vivian. The gate, she said. He picked up the pen. They moved on the brownstone at 4:17 in the morning. Reese met them 6 blocks out with Tony Caruso and 2 men Caruso had personally vetted, young, quiet, with the specific kind of calm that came from having been frightened enough times that it stopped being interesting. Marichen was on the phone with a laptop open in the back of Reese's car, running financial surveillance on every Ricci account she could access, looking for the movement that would indicate Ricci was preparing to run rather than waiting. He's not moving money, she said when Damien leaned in through the window. Everything's static. He thinks he's secure. He thinks he has 8 people in a brownstone, Damien said. He has 8 people in a brownstone. He also has a very specific problem with his northeast access point that he's about to discover. Damien straightened up. He looked down the dark street toward the block where the brownstone sat, invisible from here, just a destination. Then he looked at Vivian beside him. She had changed into clothes from the go bag. Dark, practical, the kind of thing you could move in. She had her hair pulled back. The Portland version of her. The careful, invisible, deeply patient woman who had survived 9 months of complete isolation was still present. But there was something overlaid on it now. Something that had come forward since the alley, since the young man with the shaking hand, since she had stood on the right side of a fence with both her children in her arms and heard a gunshot and decided she was done letting other people determine the perimeter of her life. You don't have to do this, Damien said, quietly. Not the command he'd tried in the kitchen, just a man saying a true thing. I know, she said. The gate, the alley, and then you wait. That's all. You get me in, and you wait. I know what we agreed. Vivian. She looked at him. We're burning time. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned to Reese. Caruso takes the front. Passive. No approach until I signal. Reese, you're on the parking level access, south side. He paused. Nobody moves until I'm inside. He didn't say what happened after that. He didn't need to. The service alley smelled like 3-week-old garbage and city wet, and the faint chemical tang of something she couldn't identify. Cleaning solvent, maybe, or the exhaust from the building's ventilation. The cobblestones were slick with moisture, and she moved over them carefully, her feet finding the dry edges by instinct. 15 feet ahead of Damien because she had insisted and he had conceded because her logic was airtight and he was smart enough to know it. The maintenance gate was a heavy iron thing with a keypad lock. She'd memorized the code from Mara's laptop, a building maintenance record accessed through the property management company's server at 3 in the morning. She keyed it in. The lock disengaged with a solid chunk of mechanism. She pushed the gate open 4 inches. Looked. The alley opened into a narrow courtyard at the brownstone's rear. One man visible, standing near the back door with his back half turned, a cigarette cupped in his hand in the specific way that meant he was trying to hide it from his employer rather than from potential threats. His attention was inward. Not good tradecraft, but at 4 in the morning on what he thought was a secured perimeter, perhaps he had decided to relax. She eased back to Damien. 1. Rear door. Not attentive. He nodded. There's a basement window on the east wall, she murmured. Ground level, hinged outward. The security system covers the door and the parking level. It doesn't cover the window. It shows as a blind spot on the building schematic. He looked at her. Mara sent it to my phone 20 minutes ago, she said. A sound that was almost a different version of the look she'd seen on his face when he held Mia for the first time. Something that had no word because it had too many things in it at once. 30 seconds, he said. Give me 30 seconds with the man by the door. Damien. But he was already moving. She pressed herself against the gate frame and counted. At 22 seconds, the cigarette hit the ground and a body weight settled onto cobblestones with less noise than she expected, and Damien appeared in the gap of the courtyard and waved her through. She went to the basement window. It opened outward on corroded hinges, and she held her breath against the scrape of metal. The drop inside was 6 feet onto a concrete floor that she could see by the ambient light from the courtyard. Storage, boxes, the bulk shapes of mechanical systems. She went in first, because that had not been what they agreed, and she knew it, and she did it anyway. The basement connected to a utility corridor that ran toward the building's central staircase, a servant's passage, probably original to the brownstone's 19th century construction, too narrow for 2 people abreast and smelling of a century and a half of accumulated moisture and pipework. She moved through it with her hand trailing the right wall, counting doors. Damien was directly behind her. She could hear him breathing, even, controlled. The way she'd heard him breathe in the car and across the kitchen table and through the 4-inch gap of a chain door in Portland, and the familiarity of it was the strangest thing in this corridor in the dark, that she knew the sound of this man breathing, the way she knew her own heartbeat, that 9 months of deliberate separation had not changed that by a single degree. The staircase door was unlocked, which was either sloppy security or a secondary trap. She held at the door and listened. Voices above, muffled, elevated, the specific tone of men waiting for news that hadn't come. She held up 2 fingers without turning around. Damien's hand touched her shoulder briefly. Acknowledgement. She pushed the door. They came up into the building's service corridor on the ground floor, which opened at the far end into the main entrance hall. The voices were coming from above, 2nd floor, the room directly over the front entrance. She could hear chairs and footsteps, and the periodic silence that meant someone was on a phone. She counted 2 men between them and the staircase, both with their attention divided between the front windows and their phones, neither looking at the corridor. Damien went right. She went left. She used the wall and a side table and the specific combination of stillness and deliberate movement that she had learned over 9 months from nothing more than the necessity of not being caught. She reached the nearer man, and she was not proud of what she did next, and she did not hesitate. The man went down. She looked up. Damien had his arm around the second man's neck, and the man was already losing consciousness, going limp in increments, and Damien lowered him to the floor with a care that was purely practical. Quiet landing, no alarm. Vivian looked at the staircase. Ricci is on the 2nd floor, she said. Barely a whisper. I know. How do you want to do this? He looked at her. The cut on his cheekbone had dried to a dark line. His eyes were the color of deep water in the low light of the corridor, and they held something she recognized from 7 years of reading this face. Not the calculation and not the coldness, but the thing that lived under both of those. The thing that was still and certain and entirely without theater. I go up, he said. You stay here. Damien, Vivian, please. The word was stripped clean. No command in it, no strategy, just a man saying one word to a woman he had failed in every way that mattered and was trying, in whatever inadequate way was available in the next 30 seconds, not to fail again. Please stay here. She looked at him. She thought about the warehouse and the alley and the fence. She thought about Mia in a stranger's arms and the sound of a gunshot she still hadn't accounted for. She thought about 2 children asleep in a locked room in Westchester with Gerald the accountant's porch light on. 3 minutes, she said. Then I'm coming up. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he turned and went up the stairs, and she stood at the bottom with her back against the wall and her hand pressed flat against her sternum where her heart was doing something loud and arrhythmic and completely out of her control, and she counted. 1, 2. Above her footsteps. Then a door. Then voices. Sharp, fast, the specific staccato of a confrontation landing without warning. 20. 21. A sound she couldn't identify. Furniture, maybe. Something with weight behind it. 40. The voice that came through the ceiling was Damien's. She couldn't make out words, but she could make out tone, and the tone was controlled and absolute in a way that meant he had the advantage. That particular register that meant the situation had resolved itself in his direction. 58. 59. Then another voice. Older, rougher, accented in a way she recognized, but Marco Ricci's voice, which she had heard exactly once, at a function 3 years into her marriage, when Ricci had been across a room and she had watched Damien clock the man's presence and recalculate his own position without changing his expression by a single degree. The words came through the floor clearly enough that she caught 2 of them. The children. Her hand left the wall. She was moving up the stairs before the second word had fully registered, moving on pure animal instinct with every rational argument for staying below evaporating like water on hot metal, because Marco Ricci was in a room above her saying 2 words that had no business in his mouth, and she was done with being on the wrong side of a floor from the things that mattered. She hit the second floor landing and turned right toward the light spilling from the open door, and she pushed through it and stopped. Damien was standing in the center of the room with a weapon leveled at a man seated behind a desk. Marco Ricci was in his 60s, compact, white-haired, with the particular solidity of a man who had been powerful long enough that power had become physical, had settled into his posture and his jaw and the way he occupied a chair. 3 of his men were against the wall to the left, neutralized by a combination of Damien's approach and the 2 men standing with Reese, who had come in through the front 30 seconds behind the schedule they'd agreed on. Ricci was not looking at Damien, he was looking at Vivian. "The mother," he said. His voice was almost appreciative, like he was completing a picture. "I thought you were dead." "That's been a useful misunderstanding," she said. "Not useful enough, apparently." He looked between her and Damien. "This is a problem you've gone to a great deal of trouble to solve. I respect that. I genuinely do." He said it the way a man said something he meant, which was somehow worse than if he'd been performing it. "But you understand that this—" He gestured at the room, at the weapons, at the whole architecture of the night. "This doesn't actually resolve the underlying situation." "The underlying situation," Damien said, "is that you sent men to put a gun against my daughter's head." "The underlying situation," Ricci said calmly, "is that your underboss has been conducting a private negotiation with my family for 2 years using your name, and the terms of that negotiation include arrangements that your heirs would eventually have a legal claim to contest." He folded his hands on the desk. "Children change inheritance. Inheritance creates disputes. Disputes are expensive and destabilizing, and I have spent 30 years building something I do not intend to have destabilized by—" "Stop talking," Vivian said. Ricci looked at her. "You sent men for my children," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I don't need to hear the business case. There is no version of this conversation where the business case matters." She looked at him, not at the men by the wall, not at Damien, not at the room, directly at Marco Ricci with the same look she had used on the man in the Portland alley with his shaking hand, the same look she had used on Damien through a 4-inch door, the same look she had been assembling piece by piece over 9 months of being underestimated by everyone who had looked at her and seen only a variable to be managed. "You made a mistake about me. Everyone in this situation has made a mistake about me, and I have been patient about it because I had children to protect, and patience was the tool available. I don't have to be patient anymore." Ricci held her gaze. Something moved through his expression. Not fear exactly, but the recalibration of a man encountering something he hadn't accounted for. "What is it you want?" he said. She opened her mouth to answer. The window behind Ricci's desk exploded inward. Not a bullet, a body. One of Ricci's external perimeter men, coming through glass and frame, and the curtain behind it with the specific catastrophic momentum of someone who had been thrown rather than who had jumped, and he hit the floor and didn't get up. And in the doorway behind Vivian, a new voice said, with the flat, exhausted cadence of a man who had been shot once already tonight, and had driven from Portland to New York regardless. Nobody move. She turned around. Luca Romano was standing in the doorway with a weapon in each hand and a pressure bandage on his left side that had soaked through to a dark red that was still spreading, and his honest-looking face was the color of old concrete, and his eyes were moving across the room with the specific, systematic attention of a man counting threats and calculating odds in the last window of time available to him before his body made the decision his will was currently overriding. He looked at Vivian, then at Damien. "I told you I'd finish this," he said. His legs were already beginning to fail beneath him, and Damien was moving toward him across the room, and Ricci was on his feet behind the desk, and Vivian stood at the exact center of everything that was about to happen with both hands empty and her mind running faster than she had ever needed it to run, because the pieces were all in the room now, and whatever came next would determine everything that came after. And she had maybe 4 seconds before Luca Romano hit the floor and the room became a problem with no solution. Vivian moved first. Not toward Ricci, not toward Luca, toward the center of the room, the geometric center, the point from which she could be seen clearly by every person present. She put herself there, and she raised both empty hands to shoulder height, and she spoke at a volume that filled the room without requiring anyone to strain to hear it. Everyone stop. It worked because it was unexpected. In a room full of armed men in the final seconds before catastrophe, a woman with empty hands stepping into the open and saying 2 words with that particular quality of absolute certainty, not a plea, not a command, something that lived between them, created a half-second of collective hesitation, and half a second was enough. "Luca is dying," she said. She said it plainly, without drama, the way you said a true thing that everyone in the room already knew but hadn't named yet. "He has information that everyone in this room needs before he does. So nobody fires another shot until he's said what he came here to say." She looked at Ricci. "You especially." Ricci looked at her, then at Luca in the doorway, who was using the door frame as a brace with a rigidity that was visibly costing him. Then back at her. "He came here to die in front of me," Ricci said. "He came here to finish it," Vivian said. "There's a difference. And you know there's a difference, or you would have already—" "Vivian," Luca's voice, rough, something wet in it now that hadn't been there before. "Stop defending me. I'm not defending you. I'm buying you 2 minutes." She turned to look at him fully. His color was wrong. A grayish white that meant the blood loss had crossed a threshold his body was only now beginning to invoice. He was still holding both weapons, but the left one had dropped a few degrees, the arm no longer fully cooperative. "Talk. Whatever you came here to say it now." He looked at her for a moment, then at Damien, who had not lowered his weapon and whose face was a controlled surface over something volcanic. Then at Ricci, who had moved around the side of the desk with the careful lateral movement of a man keeping options open. "The arrangement you think we have," Luca said to Ricci. His voice was getting slower, not slurring, deliberate, each word carried with effort. "The access I promised you, the route structures, the financial architecture, the partnership." He paused, a breath that cost something. "It's documented, all of it. Every conversation, every transfer, every commitment made under the Moretti name. 18 months of records." Another pause. "And copies of those records were transmitted at midnight tonight to the law enforcement contacts that Damien has maintained for 20 years as mutual deterrence." The room went very still. "Those records," Luca continued, "name Marco Ricci as the primary beneficiary of an unauthorized negotiation conducted through criminal conspiracy. They name the Ricci family as complicit in the murder of Carlo Benedetti. They name 6 additional homicides across 3 states that trace to the same arrangement." He looked at Ricci with eyes that were getting heavier but hadn't lost focus. "I built the documentation the same way I built everything else. Carefully. Over a long time. The difference is that this one wasn't designed to hurt Damien." He stopped. "It was designed to end you." Ricci's face had not moved. That was the frightening thing about it. The absolute absence of visible reaction. The sealed-off quality of a man who had survived 60 years by never giving a room what it was watching for. But his left hand, resting on the edge of the desk, had closed around the wood with a grip that had gone white at the knuckles. "You're bluffing," Ricci said. "Check your phone," Luca said. "Your lawyer has already called you twice in the last 4 minutes." A beat of silence. Then Ricci reached into his jacket pocket and looked at the screen. Whatever he saw there made nothing on his face change, but the grip on the desk edge tightened by another degree. "You built a case against yourself," Damien said. I was looking at Luca with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not the volcanic thing, not the calculation. Something that was working its way toward a form it hadn't found yet. "You documented your own conspiracy." "I documented the conspiracy and then I put myself inside it as the primary architect," Luca said. "Which I was. Which is accurate." Another breath, slower now. "The records protect Damien because they establish unambiguously that the Moretti Empire was defrauded from within. They protect Vivian because they establish the manufactured evidence against her as part of the same fraud. They destroy the Ricci family's legal standing in every jurisdiction where they currently operate because they establish direct participation in crimes that have no statute of limitations." He looked at Ricci one more time. "And they go to print with or without me. The transmission at midnight was automated. The only way to stop it was a code I haven't given anyone." "Why?" Damien said. The word came out stripped of everything except the question itself. Luca looked at him. Something moved across his face. The first thing all night that looked less like strategy and more like the thing underneath strategy, the thing that existed before a man learned to plan and calculate and manage outcomes. It was tired. It was old. It was the expression of a man who had spent 11 years inside a decision he believed in and had arrived at the end of it here, in this room, held upright by a doorframe and the remaining momentum of a will that was running on reserves. "Because Carlo called me first," he said. "Carlo came to me before he went to you. He sat across from me and he told me what he'd found. And he looked at me the way he'd looked at me for 18 years. Like I was someone worth trusting." He stopped. The breath was audible now. "And I made the choice I made. And I have had 6 weeks to live inside that choice." He looked at Damien. "There's nothing I can give you back. I know that. But I can give you this." The left weapon dropped first. Not deliberately. The arm simply stopped cooperating and the gun hit the floor, and Luca didn't look down at it. He kept his eyes on Damien until his legs made the decision his will had been postponing, and then Damien crossed the room in 4 strides and caught him before he hit the floor, going down on one knee with Luca's weight against him. And the picture they made, Damien Moretti on his knee on Marco Ricci's floor, holding the man who had destroyed his marriage and killed his oldest friend, was so far outside the logic of the world they had all been living in, that for a moment the room simply held it without anyone saying anything. "Get a medic," Damien said. "To Reese, to the room, to whoever was listening." Reese was already on the phone. Vivian looked at Ricci. He was looking at his phone again. Then he put it in his pocket. He looked at the men along the wall. His men, 3 of them, all with the specific expression of people whose situation had just changed in ways they were still calculating. Then he looked at Vivian with the eyes of a man who was doing math in real time and arriving at a number he didn't like. "The documentation is real," she said. Not a question. "It's real," Ricci said. "My lawyer has confirmed 2 of the filings already." "Then you understand what your options are." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're asking me to walk away." "I'm telling you that you've already lost the thing you were protecting," she said. "The arrangement with Luca is gone. The records are in the hands of people who will use them if you give them a reason to move faster than they're already moving." She held his gaze without blinking. "You have maybe 72 hours to restructure your exposure before this becomes something you can't restructure. Spending those 72 hours in a continuation of tonight is the worst possible use of them." She paused. "I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you the math." Ricci looked at her for another long moment. The white-haired, compact, immovable man who had sent people to hold a gun against her daughter's head 4 hours ago, looking at her across a room with his men on the wall and Luca Romano bleeding onto his floor, and 30 years of carefully maintained power dissolving into documentation that was already in transit. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "Nobody ever is," she said. He straightened his jacket. He looked at his men and made a small gesture she didn't fully read, but they understood it. She could see the decompression happen, the posture shifting from held tension to something that was not exactly ease but was its absence. Then he looked at Damien on the floor with Luca. "Romano was right about one thing," Ricci said. "The war has been expensive for everyone." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I'll be in touch through appropriate channels." He walked out of his own office. His men followed. The room contracted into the people who remained. Damien on the floor, Reese in the doorway on the phone, 2 of Caruso's men by the window, Vivian at the center of it all, with her hands finally lowered and her heartbeat beginning, slowly, to find its way back towards something ordinary. She looked at Luca's face. He was conscious, barely. His eyes were open and finding Damien's with an effort that was visible. "I'm sorry," he said. Quiet. Almost nothing left in it. "About Carlo. About all of it." A pause. "About the year you lost." Damien said nothing for a moment. His jaw was working. She could see the cost of what came next, could see him picking through the debris of 11 years and finding, in the wreckage, the thing that was true regardless of everything else. "You're going to the hospital," Damien said, "and then we're going to have a conversation that you are going to be alive for. You understand me?" Something moved across Luca's face. Not relief, not gratitude. Something more private and more complicated. "Yeah," he said. The medic arrived 11 minutes later. It took 3 months to complete what Luca had started. The documentation held. The law enforcement contacts Damien had maintained as mutual deterrents, career prosecutors and federal investigators who had existed in a careful equilibrium with the Moretti organization for 2 decades, never quite moving against it because the intelligence sharing had always made the calculation too close to call, received the transmitted records and found them exactly as comprehensive as Luca had described. The Ricci family's exposure was catastrophic and total. 2 of Marco Ricci's senior associates were in federal custody within a week. Ricci himself entered a negotiation with his lawyers that consumed the entirety of his attention and resources and would continue to do so for years. He never made another move toward the Moretti family. Damien spent 6 weeks dismantling the internal structure that Luca had built within his organization. The parallel loyalties, the purchased relationships, the carefully positioned assets that had been working against the empire from within. He did it methodically, without theater, following a map that Mara Chen assembled from the financial records, and that Danny Reese helped him execute on the ground. He removed people. Some of them left quietly. 2 of them didn't leave quietly, and those situations were handled in the way that situations were handled in this world, which Vivian understood and did not ask about. He was honest with her about everything else. That was the thing she had asked for, in the kitchen in Westchester on the morning after Portland and New York and all of it, when they had sat across from each other with coffee that neither of them drank, and the children asleep upstairs, and the entire future sitting on the table between them like something neither was sure how to pick up. "I need to know everything," she had said. "Not just the crisis. Not just the parts that are immediately relevant. Everything about how you operate, how decisions get made, what the exposure looks like, what I'm asking my children to grow up in the middle of." She had held his gaze. "If I stay, if we try to rebuild this, I'm not doing it blind again. I'm not the woman you kept at a careful distance from the parts that were too complicated. I was already inside it. I was always inside it. The only thing the distance did was make me vulnerable." He had looked at her for a long time. She had watched him work through it, the reflex toward compartmentalization, the 20-year habit of managing what the people around him knew, and she had watched him arrive, slowly, at the other side of it. "That's going to take time," he said. "Not because I don't want to, because there are things I've never explained to anyone." "I know," she said. "I have time." He nodded once. "Okay." It was the most consequential single syllable she had ever heard from him. Luca Romano survived his injuries. The surgery took 4 hours and the recovery took 8 weeks, and he spent them in a facility that had no connection to either the Moretti or Ricci organizations under a name that Mara Chen had constructed from public records. Damien paid for the surgery. When Vivian found out, she said nothing. She understood what it meant without needing it explained. Not forgiveness, not the cancellation of a debt, but the specific refusal to let hatred be the thing that determined the next decision. She recognized it because she had been making that same refusal in various forms for the better part of a year. Damien visited once, at week 5. He didn't tell her before he went, and he told her afterward without being asked. He sat at the kitchen table in the Westchester house where they were still staying while the logistics of New York were sorted, and he told her what they had said, and she listened without interrupting. "He asked about the children," Damien said. She looked at him. "Their names. Whether they were healthy." He paused. "I told him." She thought about that. About Luca Romano in a recovery room asking about the names of the children he had inadvertently endangered and directly caused to spend 5 months without a father, asking about them the way a person asked about something they understood they had forfeited the right to know, but needed to know anyway. Was that the right thing to do? Damien asked. She thought about it seriously. I don't know, she said, but I don't think it was wrong. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. I didn't say anything else about it, and neither did she. And somehow the fact that they could sit in the same kitchen with that unresolved thing between them and not need it to resolve immediately felt like evidence of something. Something that was being built, slowly, from different materials than what had been there before. They moved back to New York in November. Not to the Moretti estate, that came later and differently, and after a series of conversations about what living inside that address meant and what it asked of the people inside it. First, an apartment in Brooklyn, on a high floor with windows that faced east and caught the morning in a way that made the rooms feel larger than they were. Vivian chose it. Damien furnished it. They did not discuss the symbolism of this division of labor, and it did not need discussion. She went back to work. Not the contract paralegal labor of the Portland apartment, real work, the career she had interrupted when she married into a world that didn't know what to do with a woman who had her own professional gravity. She took on a case through a referral from a former colleague, a complex financial fraud matter that required exactly the kind of patient, architecture-level thinking she had been applying to her own survival for the past year. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The year had made her better. Damien came to her office one afternoon in December and stood in the doorway looking at the desk covered in documents and the window behind her with the city spread out and the expression on her face that she didn't know she was wearing. The focused, unguarded look of someone doing the thing they were made to do. He stood there for a moment before she looked up. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I was just nothing. She looked at him. Damien. He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, and he looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. I need to say the thing I've been not saying, he said. Okay. I looked at a piece of paper and I chose the paper over 7 years. He said it without flinching, without the controlled flatness, without the management, just the plain, unvarnished fact of it. I had a document and I had you, and I believed the document, and I knew you. I knew you better than I have ever known another person, and I still... He stopped, started again. There is no version of that I can explain or excuse. I've tried to find one. I don't have one. She looked at him across the desk. I know, she said. I know you know. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to absolve it. I'm telling you that I know what I did, and I know what it cost you, and I'm going to spend a very long time making sure you never have reason to question again whether I will choose you. The afternoon light came through the window at a long angle, the specific low gold of a New York December afternoon, and it fell across the desk and across his face and across the documents between them. Vivian looked at him, and she thought about a conference room on the 42nd floor and a pen that shook, and a decision she had made in an elevator going down, to protect, to survive, to keep 2 small lives safe until the truth caught up with the lies that had buried it. The truth had caught up. I know you will, she said, and she meant it. The ceremony was in February. Not a remarriage in any formal legal sense. They were still technically married. The divorce finalized under circumstances that a very quiet legal process was in the process of unwinding. But a ceremony, chosen deliberately, because Vivian had decided that some things needed to be said out loud in front of witnesses rather than just understood between 2 people in a kitchen. It was small. The Brooklyn apartment, the living room rearranged to hold 20 people. Reese was there with his wife, Mara Chen. Tony Caruso, who had brought flowers that were slightly too large for the space and seemed embarrassed about it. Diane, who had driven from New Jersey and who held Vivian's hands in both of hers before the ceremony and didn't say anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. Gerald, the accountant from Westchester, who had been invited on an impulse and who sat in the back row with the expression of a man genuinely moved to find himself inside a story this large. Mrs. Park had sent a card. It said, "Heat kicks in slow." Vivian had laughed for the first time in a long time when she read it, and had put it on the refrigerator where it still was. Mia and Leo were present in the particular way of 10-month-old infants, present, insistent, deeply opinionated about the proceedings, and entirely unconcerned with decorum. Leo had begun pulling himself to standing that week, a development that had required the immediate relocation of several items that had previously been considered safely out of reach. Mia had developed a laugh that was disproportionately large for her body and that she deployed without warning at unpredictable intervals. And she deployed it twice during what were supposed to be the quiet moments of the ceremony, and both times the room collapsed into its own laughter rather than maintaining the intended solemnity. And both times Vivian thought, yes, exactly, this is exactly right. They didn't use formal vows. Vivian had declined to write vows because she felt that the things she needed to say had already been said. In a kitchen at 3 in the morning, in a Brooklyn office on a December afternoon, in the accumulated weight of a year of choosing every day to build something rather than simply mourn what had been destroyed. What she said instead, standing in her own living room with Damien across from her and Leo on her hip, and Diane crying quietly in the second row, was this: I don't want to pretend the year didn't happen. I don't want to perform a version of this where we start from zero, and the pain was just the price of admission to a better story. The year happened. What you believed happened. What I did alone happened. She looked at him. I want to build something that has room for all of that. Something that doesn't require us to forget in order to move forward. I can do that. I think you can too. Damien held her gaze. He had not written vows either. What he said was, I will never again choose a piece of paper over you. Simple, specific, irrevocable. It was the best thing he had ever said to her. The months that followed were not a clean resolution. They were work. The specific ongoing work of two people rebuilding trust with the full awareness of why it had needed rebuilding, which was harder in some ways than building it the first time. There were conversations that were difficult. There were nights when the distance between them reasserted itself and had to be crossed again consciously, without the momentum of early love to carry them. There were moments when Vivian looked at him across a room and felt the residue of the conference table on the 42nd floor, the pen in her hand, the way he had walked out without looking back. She didn't hide those moments from him. That had been part of the condition, the refusal to perform a recovery that was neater than the actual one. She said one evening in March, standing at the kitchen counter while Damien was reading something at the table, I'm having one of those nights. He put down what he was reading. Tell me. I keep thinking about the conference room, the way you looked at me. She was not crying. She had done the crying months ago, alone in the Portland apartment. What she felt now was something different and smaller. Not grief, but its scar tissue. I know you believed what you were shown. I know that, but it still sits somewhere. He came and stood beside her at the counter, not across from her. Beside her, facing the same direction, both of them looking at the dark window with the city's reflection in it. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to fix it, she said. I'm just, she searched for the word, naming it. Okay. He was quiet for a moment. Is there anything I can do? She thought about it. Just be here. I'm here. I know. She looked at his reflection in the dark glass. That's actually the thing that makes it better. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the counter. She turned hers over and held it. They stood there for a while. The city went on outside the window, indifferent and continuous. And Mia and Leo were asleep in the next room with their specific and undeniable reality. And the kitchen was warm, and she could feel his pulse through his palm where their hands were joined. This was not the marriage they had started with. It was something more weather-beaten and more honest and considerably more hard-won, and it had cost them both things they would never fully recover. And it was, she held that thought, turned it over, confirmed it. It was real in a way the first version had not entirely been. The first version had been built partly on the convenient blindnesses that love permitted in the early years. This one had no convenient blindnesses left. It had been stripped down to load-bearing elements only, and what remained was what remained, and what remained was enough. It was enough. In April, on a morning that came in gray and then clarified into something warm and almost reckless with light, Vivian took the twins to a park 3 blocks from the apartment. She put them in the double stroller, a complicated piece of equipment she had mastered through sheer repetition and that Damien had still not fully reconciled with, which she found quietly entertaining. And she walked the path that ran along the water, where the budding trees were doing their early April thing of looking tentative. And then suddenly, between one glance and the next, being fully committed. Mia was watching the trees with her characteristic focused attention. Leo was watching a dog with a level of intensity that suggested he had made a significant personal decision about dogs. Vivian walked, and she did not think about Portland or the warehouse or the 42nd floor. She thought about the afternoon ahead. Work she was interested in, a phone call with Diane, Damien picking the twins up at 3 because it was his turn, and he had become, with the particular determination he brought to everything he decided to master, genuinely good at it. She thought about dinner and about a conversation she and Damien had started the night before, about something unrelated to survival or strategy or the management of threat, something ordinary and unimportant that she couldn't even quite remember the substance of, only the feeling of it, the specific lightness of a conversation that had no stakes. She stopped on the path where a bench faced the water. She sat. She put the brake on the stroller and she looked at the river, which was doing its February into April transition, darker and faster than it would be in summer, still carrying the cold in it. She had spent 9 months building a life designed to be invisible. She had spent the year since then building one designed to last. They were different skills. The second one was harder and slower, and required her to stay in one place long enough for things to take root, which was not a thing she had been able to do when staying meant being found. Now she stayed. It was a choice she made every day, consciously, with full knowledge of what it had cost to be here and what it required to remain. The vigilance that would never fully leave her, the operational awareness that she had wired into herself over a hard year and that now simply lived there as a kind of background frequency. She was not the woman who had signed divorce papers. She was not the woman who had packed a go-bag and crossed a fence in the dark. She was whatever came after both of those women, assembled from what they had learned, carrying their experience without being defined by it. Mia made a sound. Vivian looked down and found her daughter looking up at her with those dark, patient eyes. Damien's eyes. A fact that had initially complicated her feelings, and now simply was what it was. One of the many ways this family was made of everything that had happened to it. "Hi," Vivian said. Mia held her gaze with the absolute seriousness of a child who has not yet learned that some moments don't require total attention. Leo, without looking away from the dog that had long since moved on, made a sound of decisive agreement about something. Vivian laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, rising from somewhere below the ribs, the kind that required nothing to cause it except a morning in April and 2 small people and the uncomplicated fact of being exactly where she was, having survived exactly what she had survived, with the rest of it still ahead. The river moved past. The trees made their decision about spring. A dog barked somewhere and Leo's head swiveled with the speed of pure purpose. She had burned down a life and rebuilt it, and it was not pristine and it was not simple, and there was not a single day of the past 18 months she would choose to relive. But she would not trade what she had arrived at, not for the version that had never been tested, not for the clean story where none of it had happened. This one was hers. All of it, the beautiful and the terrible and the everyday, was hers. She reached forward and adjusted the blanket across Leo's knees where it had slipped. She tucked it back into place. She looked at her children in the morning light, and she breathed, and the river kept moving, and that was the whole of it. That was every last word of it, the complete and final and entirely sufficient truth of everything that remained.